I woke up to the sound of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and a violin playing some annoyingly elegant tune. That was odd because, as far as I knew, I didn't own a wedding venue. Yet when I walked to my window and looked outside, I saw something that made my morning coffee almost shoot out of my nose. My barn, my old, hard-working, never-bothered-anyone barn, had been completely transformed. White drapes hung from the rafters, fairy lights twinkled like some romantic fantasy, and rows of chairs were neatly lined up facing an altar. A flower-adorned arch stood in front of a small stage where a priest adjusted his microphone. The whole scene looked like something straight out of a high-end wedding catalog. Except for one tiny detail, no one had bothered to ask me if they could use my damn barn. I threw on my boots and stormed outside. My dog, Duke, trotted beside me, his ears perked up like he knew today's stupidity was going to be something special. The first person I locked eyes with was a woman in an obnoxiously large sun hat barking orders at the catering staff. I knew her. Everyone knew her. Cheryl, the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association. The woman who once fined me for leaving my truck parked too ruggedly in my own driveway. The woman who had turned our quiet neighborhood into a dictatorship of unnecessary rules and ridiculous power plays. And now, apparently, she had decided my barn belonged to her. "Cheryl," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "What the hell is this?" She turned, flashing a fake smile polished to perfection. "Oh, Rick, good morning. Isn't it just beautiful? We really transformed this place, didn't we?" "We?" I asked, stepping forward. I don't remember being part of any we, because if I had been, I would have told you you're out of your damn mind. Cheryl laughed, as if I had just told the funniest joke. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just a wedding, and it's for my daughter, Brittany. You remember Brittany, don't you?" I remembered Brittany. She was the kind of person who once threw a tantrum in the grocery store because they didn't have the right kind of organic water. But that wasn't the point. The point was that 100 strangers were setting up shop on my land without so much as a text message. "You didn't ask," I said, my patience thinning by the second. "Oh, Rick, don't be selfish," Cheryl said, waving a dismissive hand. "This is for the community. We all have to make sacrifices." "Sacrifices," I repeated. "Cheryl, you're throwing a full-blown wedding in my barn." "Well, technically it's not really yours," she said, tilting her head. "The HOA governs all properties in this neighborhood, and this barn falls under their purview." I took a deep breath and clenched my jaw. "Cheryl, I own this barn. I pay taxes on this barn. The HOA doesn't own my land." She scoffed. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. Besides, it's already set up. What do you want me to do? Cancel my daughter's wedding. Do you know how much this cost?" I looked around. The decorators were putting up final touches. Caterers were setting up fancy appetizers on silver trays, and guests were already arriving in expensive suits and designer dresses. Cheryl had planned this for months, and she had never, not once, thought she needed my permission. "I want you to pack it all up and leave," I said firmly. Cheryl gasped, as if I had told her I planned to kick a puppy. "Rick, be reasonable. It's just one day. One beautiful, magical day. You don't even use this barn for anything important." I narrow my eyes. "I use it to store hay. And my bulls." Cheryl gave a light, airy laugh. "Oh, don't worry. We moved all that stuff out this morning. Everything's in your field." I turned my head toward the pasture. Sure enough, my neatly stacked hay bales were tossed across the field like someone had played a drunken game of Jenga. My toolboxes were left open, and some of my equipment was exposed to the morning sun. But what really caught my attention were my bulls, Brutus and Havoc, standing at the far end of the pasture, staring toward the barn. They looked agitated, and for good reason. They didn't like change, and they definitely didn't like strangers. I inhaled sharply, fighting the urge to explode. "Cheryl, you're trespassing." She rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't be such a stick in the mud. No one's trespassing. Look, I even have permission." She reached into her purse and pulled out a piece of paper, handing it to me with a smug look. I glanced down and nearly laughed. It was a printed HOA notice signed with a scribbled name that was barely legible. "This is not a legal document," I said, shoving it back into her hands. "This is garbage. Cheryl huffed. It's an official HOA approval. Istère de here. Cheryl, the HOA has no right to give away my barn. Oh, stop making a fuss, she said. Everything's already set up. It's too late to change anything now. I looked at her, then at the guests, then at my bulls. A slow smile spread across my face. Fine, I said. Cheryl blinked. Excuse me. You're right, I said. It's already set up. I wouldn't want to ruin your daughter's big day. Her lips curled into a satisfied grin. Oh, I'm so glad you see reason, Rick. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to check on the caterers. I watched her turn and sashay away, her overconfidence practically oozing from every step. I looked back at Brutus and Havoc, still pacing near the fence, and I made a decision. If Cheryl wanted a wedding in my barn, she was going to get one. She was also going to get my bulls. I took my time making my way toward their gate. Brutus lifted his head at me, nostrils flaring. Havoc pawed the ground, already on edge from the disruption to his routine. They were ready, and so was I. I unlatched the gate. Then I whispered, just loud enough for them to hear, "Go introduce yourselves to the wedding guests." And with that, I stepped back and watched the chaos begin. Continued in next message. The day the bulls crashed the wedding. Part 2. The wedding was in full swing. Guests were seated, sipping champagne, and chatting about the extravagant setup. The floral arrangements, the silk-draped chairs, and the ridiculous ice sculpture of Brittany and her fiancé locked in a romantic embrace were all perfect. Too perfect. Everything about the scene screamed entitlement. Cheryl was in her element, floating from guest to guest, bragging about how she secured the most stunning rustic venue in the county. She made sure to drop my name into conversations as if I had been an eager participant in her grand scheme. Every now and then, she shot me a triumphant smirk like she had won. I smiled back. She had no idea what was coming. The music started, signaling the ceremony was about to begin. The guests turned their attention to the makeshift aisle as Brittany made her entrance. She walked with all the grace of a celebrity on a red carpet, her designer wedding dress trailing behind her like a symbol of pure privilege. The moment was picture perfect. People pulled out their phones, whispering about how beautiful she looked. Even I had to admit it was going well. Too well. I leaned casually against the barn door, watching, waiting. Then, as the priest cleared his throat to begin the vows, I heard it. The sound I had been waiting for. A low, rumbling snort. A heavy stomp against the dirt. The shifting of powerful muscle as two very large, very irritable bulls realized something was happening inside their barn. The first shriek came from an older woman in the front row who turned just in time to see Brutus and Havoc charging straight toward the ceremony. At first, the guests thought it was part of some elaborate wedding entertainment. A few people even clapped. Then Brutus let out a deep, guttural bellow, and Havoc, true to his name, knocked over the champagne tower with one casual swing of his massive head. Panic rippled through the crowd like slow-motion fireworks. The bride gasped, clutching her chest like she was about to faint. The groom took a hesitant step back, his eyes darting between the bulls and Cheryl, as if unsure which was the bigger threat. The priest, to his credit, attempted to keep going, holding on to his Bible like it could protect him from the 2-ton forces of nature barreling through the reception. Then came the screaming. Chairs flipped. Glasses shattered. A woman in heels tried to run, but twisted her ankle and collapsed into the wedding cake. Her flailing arms sent the top tier, flying into the air, landing squarely on the groom's mother. The woman let out an unholy screech, which was immediately drowned out by the stampede of panicked guests fleeing for their lives. Cheryl stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. She tried to bark orders, waving her arms as if she could control the chaos. But no one was listening. People were too busy scrambling onto tables, tripping over decorations, and diving into bushes in desperate attempts to escape. Brittany's shriek cut through the madness as she lifted the hem of her $1,000 dress and attempted to run. Unfortunately for her, layers of lace and tulle weren't designed for speed. She barely made it 2 steps before her heel caught on the fabric, sending her tumbling forward. She landed face first into the decorative punch bowl, emerging seconds later dripping red liquid from head to toe, resembling something out of a low-budget horror film. Her groom, in an impressive display of self-preservation, had already abandoned her. He sprinted toward the parking lot without so much as a glance back. Brutus, having thoroughly enjoyed flipping over tables, turned his attention to the buffet. With one swift motion, he sent the roast beef platter soaring, splattering half the guests with gravy. Meanwhile, Havoc locked eyes with the wedding band, who had made the unfortunate decision to stay put. Instruments in hand, the lead singer attempted a shaky rendition of a love song as a form of distraction. It didn't work. Havoc snorted and charged. The drummer let out a strangled yelp and dove onto the roof of the barn. The rest of the band followed, scrambling for safety as their expensive instruments were trampled beneath Havoc's powerful hooves. Cheryl, realizing her perfect wedding was in ruins, turned toward me. Fury blazed in her eyes as she stomped through the chaos, dodging overturned tables and fleeing guests. Her designer dress was stained with an unfortunate mixture of cake frosting and what I suspected was wine. "Ew," she screeched, jabbing a perfectly manicured finger at my chest. "You did this." I crossed my arms and raised an eyebrow. "Did what?" "I don't control the bulls." "You let them out on purpose," she accused, her voice hitting a pitch that made Duke flatten his ears. I shrugged. "I was just tending to my farm animals, Cheryl. It's not my fault they got curious." She let out a noise somewhere between a growl and a sob, her rage boiling over. "You're going to pay for this. The damages, the emotional distress, everything. I'll sue you." I smiled and pulled out my phone. "Actually, Cheryl, I was thinking of pressing charges myself. Trespassing, destruction of property, unauthorized use of my land. I think the police would love to hear about this." Her eyes widened, the bravado flickering. "You wouldn't dare." I turned the phone screen toward her. It was already recording, capturing every second of the chaos, her precious guests running for their lives, Brittany wailing in the background, her groom hiding behind a tree. Most importantly, Cheryl herself admitting she had taken over my barn without permission. "Try me," I said, smirking. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Cheryl looked genuinely afraid. She opened her mouth, probably to issue some weak excuse, but before she could speak, Havoc, bored with destroying the wedding, turned his attention to us. With a satisfied snort, he lowered his head and charged. Cheryl barely had time to scream before she was forced to dive headfirst into the decorative wedding fountain to avoid getting run over. Freezing water splashed in all directions as she surfaced with a gasp, sputtering and flailing like a wet cat. I could have walked away then. I could have left her there, soaked, humiliated, and defeated. But instead, I leaned over the fountain, looking down at her. "Hope you enjoyed the venue," I said, "because this is the last event you'll ever have here." Then, with a satisfied nod, I turned and walked away, leaving Cheryl dripping, fuming, and utterly speechless in the ruins of her perfect wedding. Continued in next message. The day the bulls crashed the wedding. Part 3. The guests were still running. Some sprinted toward their cars, frantically yanking at locked doors while fumbling with their keys. Others had given up entirely, hiding behind bushes or jumping fences in desperate attempts to escape. The once elegant wedding setup now looked like the aftermath of a tornado. Tables overturned, plates shattered, flowers scattered across the ground. An entire roast beef platter lay half-eaten in the dirt, thanks to Brutus. The massive ice sculpture of Brittany and her now-missing groom had toppled. Brittany's frozen face lay sideways in a pool of melted water, her glassy stare as lifeless as the real Brittany, who was still sitting on the ground, drenched in punch and silently processing the destruction of her perfect day. The groom? He'd vanished. Last I saw, he was vaulting over the fence like his life depended on it. It probably did. Judging by the look on Brittany's face, she was realizing this might be a pattern for him. Meanwhile, her mother was still struggling in the wedding fountain. Her drenched designer dress clung to her like a sad, defeated flag. Cheryl flailed, sending waves of water splashing over the stone edge as she tried to heave herself out. Her fury was unmistakable, a silent promise that she'd find a way to make me pay. Unfortunately for her, I wasn't the one about to be held responsible. The HOA didn't own my barn. The wedding had been held here under false pretenses. That meant any fines, lawsuits, or damages would land squarely on Cheryl's shoulders. And then I heard the sirens. They started faint at first, growing louder as they approached. Someone had finally called the police. Probably one of the terrified guests who thought the bulls were part of some elaborate murder plot. 2 patrol cars pulled up fast, kicking up dust as they skidded to a stop. The officers stepped out, hands resting on their belts, surveying the scene in stunned silence. One of them, Deputy Morgan, a man I'd known for years, adjusted his hat and let out a long, tired sigh. "Rick," he said, his voice laced with exhaustion. "What the hell happened here?" I took my time pulling out my phone and flipping to the video I had recorded earlier. Without saying a word, I hit play and let him watch. Cheryl, in all her glory, was there on screen, admitting she'd taken over my barn without permission. Her smug attitude, her dismissiveness, her blatant disregard for my property rights, it was all there. And then the video shifted to Brutus and Havoc making their grand entrance and the chaos that followed. When the video ended, Morgan ran a hand down his face, shaking his head. "So let me get this straight," he said, looking at Cheryl, who was now standing by the fountain, drenched and shivering. "You threw a wedding on private property without permission?" Cheryl squared her shoulders and lifted her chin, trying to regain control. "This is a misunderstanding," she declared. "I have full approval from the HOA." Morgan turned back to me. "Does the HOA have any legal authority over your land?" "Nope," I said, crossing my arms. Even if they did, this was never an HOA decision. This was Cheryl making up her own rules. Cheryl laughed sharply. "Rick's being dramatic. No harm was done." Morgan slowly looked around. The destroyed decorations, overturned food tables, terrified guests, and the wedding band still perched on the barn roof like scared cats. His gaze finally landed on Brittany, who sat motionless in her ruined dress, staring blankly into space. "No harm," Morgan repeated, his tone flat. "Lady, this looks like a damn battlefield." "Oh, please," Cheryl scoffed. "This is just a minor incident. Rick should be the one in trouble. He let those bulls loose on purpose." Morgan turned to me. "That true?" I shrugged. "Bulls have minds of their own. All I did was open a gate." Morgan pinched the bridge of his nose, muttering something under his breath, then turned back to Cheryl. "Well, you're going to have to come with us." Cheryl's face twisted in outrage. "Excuse me. You trespassed," Morgan said calmly. "You hosted an unauthorized event on private property, and you caused significant damages. And that's before we even get into falsified HOA documents." Cheryl turned to her remaining guests for support, but they were either too busy licking their wounds or pretending not to know her. Even Brittany didn't bother defending her. She just sat there, whispering something about cosmic warnings. Morgan motioned for his partner to take Cheryl to the squad car. She shrieked, trying to shake off the officer's grip. "You can't do this. This is harassment. I know my rights. I'm the HOA president." The officer opened the car door. "And you have the right to remain silent." Cheryl tried to argue, but the door shut behind her. And just like that, she was officially out of my life, at least for now. The remaining guests wasted no time disappearing. Those who hadn't already fled took this as their cue to leave, making hurried excuses and avoiding eye contact. Brittany sat for a while longer, processing her ruined wedding. Eventually, she sighed, stood up, and without a word, walked barefoot toward the road, her once beautiful dress dragging behind her in the dirt. I wasn't sure where she was going. I didn't really care. As the last echoes of the wedding chaos faded, I turned my attention back to my barn. It was a mess, but nothing that couldn't be fixed. The decorations, chairs, and leftover catering trays didn't belong there. It was time to reclaim my space. Brutus and Havoc, now bored with the excitement, wandered back toward their enclosure. Their job was done. I patted Brutus on the side as he passed. "Good job, buddy," I said. "You earned an extra meal tonight." A few days later, I uploaded the footage online. It didn't take long to go viral. The video of Cheryl getting chased by bulls, diving into a fountain, and ultimately getting arrested became an instant internet sensation. News outlets picked it up. Influencers reacted to it. Late-night talk show hosts made jokes about the infamous barn wedding disaster. I didn't just get justice. I got entertainment. And better yet, I got peace. Cheryl, after the public embarrassment and legal trouble, quietly stepped down from her HOA position. No more fines for rugged truck parking. No more unnecessary rules. Just quiet, uninterrupted farm life. Exactly how I liked it. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, Duke asleep at my feet and Brutus and Havoc grazing peacefully in the field, I lifted my glass in a silent toast. "To the bulls," I said. "They'd done their job well. And best of all, the HOA would never mess with me again."